What if everything you knew about medieval witches was wrong? They weren't always the devil-worshipping crones of legend. For over 1,000 years, we can trace how village healers became heretics, how whispered remedies became Satan's recipes, and how fear transformed helpful neighbors into history's most hunted outcasts. This is the full story of medieval witches. In the shadowed centuries between Rome's fall and Charlemagne's crown, the line between salvation and sorcery blurred like smoke in a winter cottage. Village-wise women carried forward ancient knowledge, herbal remedies passed down through generations, protective charms whispered over newborns, and rituals that honored both Christian saints and older spirits that still dwelt in sacred groves. These early medieval healers lived in a world where magic was simply another tool for survival, a charm to stop bleeding, an amulet to ward off evil, a potion to ease childbirth. These weren't devil's work, but desperate necessities in a brutal age. The church itself hadn't yet decided what to make of these practices. Local priests often blessed the same herbs that village cunning folk gathered, and Christian prayers mingled freely with older incantations. But something was stirring in the ecclesiastical corridors. The Canon Episcopi, written around 900, marked the first official attempt to define the boundaries of acceptable faith. It declared that women who believed they flew through the night with the goddess Diana were victims of demonic delusion. Yet even this condemnation was ambiguous. Were these practices real or imagined? The church seemed unsure whether to dismiss them as fantasies or condemn them as sins. In monastery scriptoriums, monks began cataloging what they called superstitions, protective rituals, seasonal celebrations, and healing practices that had sustained communities for centuries. They wrote of women who claimed to ride with supernatural hosts, of charms that allegedly controlled weather, of potions that could cure or curse. But their tone remained more curious than condemning, more concerned with theological classification than criminal prosecution. This was the twilight world where medieval witchcraft was born, not in devil's sabbaths or satanic conspiracies, but in the desperate hope of mothers protecting their children, healers easing suffering, and communities clinging to whatever powers might shield them from plague, famine, and war. The transformation from wise woman to witch had begun, but the darkest chapters still lay ahead. Now, why did bishops insist night-flying women were only dreams, yet still threatened them with hell? As medieval Christianity matured between 900 and 1100, theologians faced a troubling puzzle. How could they acknowledge God's supreme power while explaining the apparent reality of magical phenomena that plagued their congregations? The scholarly halls of emerging universities buzzed with debate. If God was all-powerful, could demons truly grant mortals the ability to fly, shapeshift, or cast deadly spells? Or were these merely illusions designed to tempt the faithful into damnation? The Canon Episcopi had suggested the latter, but reality proved more stubborn than theology. People continued to report encounters with supernatural forces, and local communities still turned to cunning folk when priests' prayers seemed insufficient. Enter the trial by ordeal, God's own judgment system. When accusations of maleficium arose, the accused might be subjected to red-hot iron, boiling water, or the cold water test. If they survived unscathed or sank rather than floated, God had proclaimed their innocence. These primitive trials reflected a worldview where the divine intervened directly in human affairs, where supernatural guilt or innocence could be literally weighed and measured. Penitential handbooks began appearing in monastery libraries, cataloging sins and their appropriate punishments. Among theft, adultery, and murder, scribes carefully recorded penalties for those who participated in women's night rides or consulted sorceresses for love potions and healing charms. The punishments were often surprisingly mild, a few days fasting, some extra prayers, suggesting that authorities still viewed these practices as misguided rather than malevolent. Yet something darker was crystallizing in theological thought. Scholars like Burchard of Worms documented beliefs about women who rode with Diana or Herodias, supernatural queens who led nocturnal processions of female spirits. While officially dismissing these as delusions, the very act of recording them gave weight to their reality in popular imagination. The church was inadvertently creating a taxonomy of the supernatural that would later prove devastatingly useful for witch hunters. The foundation was being laid for a transformation that would shake medieval Europe to its core, the evolution from viewing witchcraft as foolish superstition to recognizing it as humanity's greatest spiritual threat. Could a love potion seal dynastic destinies more surely than a royal marriage treaty? Between 1100 and 1300, the very nature of magical knowledge underwent a dramatic transformation. No longer confined to village cottages and herb gardens, the study of supernatural forces found new homes in university halls and royal courts, where learned men pursued arcane wisdom with scholarly precision. The translation movement brought Arabic grimoires flooding into Latin Europe, carrying with them sophisticated magical traditions that dwarfed simple folk remedies. Books like The Picatrix and the works of Al-Kindi introduced European scholars to elaborate systems of astrology, alchemy, and ceremonial magic. These weren't crude peasant superstitions, but intellectual pursuits worthy of educated minds, magic as natural philosophy, demons as subjects for academic inquiry. University-trained clerics found themselves increasingly drawn to these forbidden arts. The line between legitimate natural philosophy and illicit necromancy grew thin when studying the movement of stars, the properties of metals, or the summoning of spiritual entities for scholarly purposes. Albertus Magnus wrote extensively on the occult properties of stones and herbs, while his student Thomas Aquinas wrestled with the theological implications of demonic contracts and supernatural interventions. Royal courts became laboratories for practical magic. Kings sought alchemists who could transmute base metals into gold, astrologers who could predict military victories, and necromancers who could commune with the dead for political intelligence. The sophisticated magic of learned men seemed worlds apart from the simple charms of village wise women, yet both drew from the same well of supernatural power. This created a crucial distinction that would shape centuries of persecution. When university-trained scholars practiced magic, they were pursuing natural philosophy or falling prey to scholarly curiosity. When village healers used herbs and incantations, they were trafficking with demons. The same practice, consulting supernatural forces for aid, became either academic inquiry or demonic conspiracy, depending on who performed it. The church began prosecuting nigromancers, learned magicians who explicitly summoned demons, while remaining relatively tolerant of traditional folk practices. This legal precedent established a pattern that would prove devastating. Educated men might face professional censure for magical pursuits, while uneducated women faced accusations of devil worship. The stage was set for a profound shift in how medieval society understood the supernatural, and who would pay the ultimate price for that understanding. When half the town lay dead, who else but witches could be pouring plague into the wells? The Black Death's arrival in 1347 shattered medieval Europe's already fragile sense of divine order. As corpses piled in city streets and entire villages fell silent, desperate survivors sought explanations for catastrophe that defied all understanding. In their terror, they found the perfect scapegoats lurking in their own communities. The pandemic transformed how people viewed the supernatural. Where once village healers had been cautiously tolerated, now their knowledge of herbs and bodies became sinister evidence of complicity with dark forces. If they could heal, surely they could also harm. If they understood the mysteries of life and death, might they not be agents of the very plague that was devouring Christendom? Flagellant processions wound through ravaged towns, their members whipping themselves bloody in desperate attempts to appease God's wrath. These penitential parades often culminated in violence against suspected witches, Jews, and other outsiders deemed responsible for divine punishment. The logic was brutally simple. God was punishing humanity for tolerating evil in its midst, and that evil walked among them in human form. Weather magic became a particular obsession. Crop failures and unseasonable storms were no longer mere misfortune, but evidence of malevolent intervention. Village women who had once been consulted about favorable planting times now found themselves accused of summoning hailstorms to destroy harvests. The same intimate knowledge of natural cycles that had made them valuable now made them dangerous. The visual culture of death permeated medieval consciousness. Dance, macabre imagery adorned church walls, showing death as the great equalizer who claimed pope and peasant alike. But alongside these memento mori appeared new images. Woodcuts of crones stirring cauldrons, manuscripts illuminated with scenes of Sabbaths and devil worship. Art was creating a visual vocabulary for evil that would outlast the plague itself. Corpse magic emerged as a particularly horrifying accusation. Survivors reported that witches dug up plague victims to harvest body parts for their spells, or that they spread disease by poisoning wells and consecrated bread. These tales fed on genuine trauma, the sight of mass graves, the smell of death, the terror of watching loved ones succumb to forces beyond comprehension. The plague years established a template for future persecutions. Catastrophe breeds suspicion, suspicion seeks scapegoats, and scapegoats are found among society's most vulnerable members. As Europe slowly recovered from demographic collapse, the mechanisms of accusation and the imagery of evil remained embedded in collective memory, waiting for the next crisis to awaken them. What changed a private vice into a kingdom-wide cabal in league with Lucifer? Between 1430 and 1484, European authorities underwent a revolutionary shift in thinking that would transform isolated accusations of harmful magic into systematic persecution of an imagined satanic conspiracy. The scattered superstitions of previous centuries suddenly coalesced into a coherent theology of evil that demanded unprecedented response. The Council of Basel became an unlikely crucible for this transformation. Gathered ostensibly to address church reform, the assembled clerics found themselves grappling with reports of organized devil worship spreading across the Alps. Johann Nieder, a Dominican reformer, documented these emerging beliefs in his Formicarius, weaving together trial records, theological speculation, and popular folklore into a comprehensive theory of witchcraft as heresy. Nieder's work marked a crucial evolution in legal and theological thinking. No longer were accused witches merely practicing harmful magic. They were apostates who had rejected Christ in favor of Satan. This wasn't about healing gone wrong or love potions turned deadly, but about a deliberate choice to serve the ultimate enemy of mankind. The implications were staggering. If witches had consciously chosen damnation, they deserved no mercy. The geographic focus proved significant. Reports concentrated in mountainous regions where ancient pagan practices had persisted longest, where communities remained isolated from central authority, and where the boundary between Christian and pre-Christian beliefs remained most porous. The Alps became a laboratory for new forms of persecution, as inquisitors experimented with techniques that would later spread across Europe. Legal procedures evolved to match theological innovation. The traditional requirement for 2 witnesses to establish guilt gave way to new standards that accepted confessions extracted under torture, testimony from accomplices seeking leniency, and evidence of supernatural phenomena that defied normal legal standards. The inquisitorial system, originally designed to combat organized heretical movements, found new purpose in confronting this imagined satanic conspiracy. Pope Innocent VIII's bull Summis Desiderantes in 1484 provided official papal authorization for this expanded persecution. The document acknowledged reports of devil worship, night flights, sexual congress with demons, and organized Sabbaths as genuine threats requiring immediate action. By lending papal authority to these beliefs, Innocent transformed local anxieties into universal Christian doctrine. The shift was profound. Witchcraft had evolved from a collection of folk practices into a systematic theology of evil, from individual transgressions into organized conspiracy, from local concerns into papal priorities. The groundwork was laid for the most systematic persecution in European history, and the architects of destruction were already sharpening their tools. Did a single book light the pyres that would scorch a continent? In 1486, 2 Dominican inquisitors named Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published a tome that would become the blueprint for organized witch persecution. The Malice Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, combined centuries of theological speculation, legal precedent, and misogynistic theory into a comprehensive manual for identifying, prosecuting, and executing practitioners of witchcraft. The book's genius lay in its systematic approach to what had previously been chaotic accusations. Kramer and Sprenger provided detailed instructions for recognizing witches, extracting confessions, and interpreting evidence that would have seemed absurd to earlier generations. They codified the emerging belief that witchcraft was predominantly a female crime, rooted in women's supposed spiritual weakness and insatiable carnal appetites. Their interrogation techniques refined torture into an art form, The strappado, where victims were hoisted by their arms tied behind their backs, became standard practice. Sleep deprivation, repeated questioning, and psychological manipulation broke down resistance until accused witches confessed to impossible crimes. The manual provided legal justification for these methods, arguing that extraordinary crimes demanded extraordinary measures. The theological framework proved equally revolutionary. Where earlier authorities had debated whether witchcraft was real or illusory, the Malice settled the question definitively. Witches possessed genuine supernatural powers granted by Satan himself. They could fly through the air, transform into animals, raise storms, cause impotence, and kill infants with a glance. These weren't delusions, but documented facts requiring immediate response. The devil worship narrative reached its full flowering in these pages. Witches didn't merely practice harmful magic. They participated in elaborate Sabbaths where they renounced Christianity, performed obscene rituals, and copulated with demons. These gatherings allegedly occurred in remote locations where covens of witches planned their attacks on Christian society. The image of organized satanic conspiracy had crystallized into official doctrine. Trial procedures became increasingly sophisticated and deadly. Testimony from accomplices carried special weight, as reformed witches could identify their former associates. The presence of devil's marks, blemishes that supposedly felt no pain, provided physical evidence of supernatural pacts. Even the act of shedding tears during torture was interpreted as evidence of guilt, since witches allegedly couldn't produce genuine tears. The printing press ensured widespread distribution of these ideas. Within decades, translated editions appeared across Europe, carried by traveling inquisitors who spread standardized persecution techniques from the Holy Roman Empire to France, from Spain to Poland. Local authorities adapted the manual's methods to their own legal systems, creating a continent-wide network of witch hunters armed with identical tools and theories. The transformation was complete. What had begun as village suspicions had evolved into systematic persecution, backed by papal authority, legal precedent, and scholarly justification. The medieval world's final chapter was being written in smoke and screams. As Renaissance dawned, why did the noose grow tighter around the village hedge witch? The opening decades of the 16th century presented a cruel paradox. While humanist scholars celebrated the dignity of man and artists captured divine beauty in marble and paint, the machinery of witch persecution reached new heights of efficiency and cruelty. The very forces that promised to enlighten Europe instead cast deeper shadows over its most vulnerable inhabitants. The printing press, that herald of intellectual progress, became the witch hunter's greatest ally. Lurid trial pamphlets circulated through market towns, their crude woodcuts depicting Sabbaths and torture scenes that inflamed popular imagination. These broadsheets transformed local accusations into continental entertainment, spreading standardized images of evil that transcended regional differences. A witch trial in Würzburg could inspire copycat persecutions from Scotland to Sicily. Economic pressures intensified social tensions that had simmered for generations. The Little Ice Age brought harvest failures and food shortages that tested community bonds. When crops failed and livestock died, desperate neighbors sought explanations in supernatural malevolence rather than climatic change. The same women who had once been consulted during agricultural crises now found themselves blamed for causing them. Religious upheaval added another layer of anxiety. As Martin Luther's protests against papal authority spread across German-speaking lands, traditional certainties crumbled. In this atmosphere of spiritual chaos, witch hunting offered authorities a way to demonstrate their commitment to Christian orthodoxy. Protestant and Catholic regions competed to prove their religious purity through increasingly savage persecutions. Yet, seeds of skepticism were already being planted. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, the renowned humanist scholar, dared to question whether the confessions extracted under torture could be trusted. His defense of accused witches in Cologne demonstrated that not all learned men accepted the new orthodoxy. Such voices remained isolated, but they represented the first cracks in the intellectual consensus that supported mass persecution. The legal apparatus grew more sophisticated and deadly. Professional witch hunters like the notorious Conrad Tors traveled between jurisdictions, offering their expertise to local authorities. They brought standardized procedures, portable torture devices, and the promise of swift justice. Their success was measured not in truth discovered, but in confessions extracted and bodies burned. Village communities found themselves trapped between competing pressures. Local authorities demanded evidence of supernatural crime, while neighbors sought explanations for inexplicable misfortune. The traditional cunning folk who had once served as community healers became lightning rods for these tensions. Their knowledge transformed from blessing to curse by the changing times. The stage was set for the greatest witch persecution in European history. Medieval foundations had been laid, legal procedures perfected, and popular imagination thoroughly prepared. All that remained was the spark that would ignite the conflagration. From whispered charms to continent-wide terror, medieval witches show how fear can rewrite reality. In an age of viral rumors, what new witch hunts wait in our own shadows? Join our coven of curious minds. Subscribe for more untold histories.